You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Welcome to The Imaginable Workplace, where we explore how to make work better. I'm Carl Javier, CEO of Puma Podcast, an award-winning podcast production company that aims to spread the joy, power, and value there is in listening.
And I'm Jackie Cañiza, founder and managing partner of Haraya Coaching. Rooted in wholeness, Haraya supports individuals and teams by creating brave and safe spaces for transformation.
In this episode, we talk about bringing your whole self to work, but not all of it. Because, seriously, may mga bagay-bagay in all of us na medyo yuck. And I really think there's stuff that you should leave at home. Like, for real. Like, don't bring that. Don't bring that to the office. And I know what I don't bring to the office. But the dominant, pervasive thing now is bring your whole self. Like, embrace what people are. So, we're going to discuss today my weird feelings about this. Jackie, where do you fall on this?
It's interesting that your response is, oh, yuck, let's not bring everything. I guess in contrast.
Lalo na kung hindi naliligo, like, dahil work from home, minsan lang mag-ano.
Well, yeah. Oh my gosh. The first question I thought of was, paano mo alam? I don't want you to answer that. It's a little different, I guess, from our perspective. In Haraya, that's it. You bring all of who you are, and it is the more you bring, the better, in my view, because it helps me to understand you as a complete human being. So I guess that's what we're going to talk about here, right? Where do those things fit in based on what kind of work environments we both have?
I want to introduce two ideas that just came to mind as you were saying, the full self and stuff like that. Kasi I wonder if there is even such a thing. So I have this arts background, and one of the core ideas that I've taken away from it is performativity. That every identity that we hold is a kind of performance. And I think it's not so much having like one identity that I bring everywhere, but that I'd read in like a neuroscience book that one form of intelligence is to be able to form and hold multiple identities within yourself and to identify and navigate those identities. So, for me, as a brother, as a husband, as an employer, as a teammate, as a teacher, as a direct one-up versus as the CEO of a company, like each of those is a different thing, and each of them is a quote-unquote different performance. And I don't know if that suddenly makes it sound inauthentic, because I also think authenticity is a key concept that we want to work around here. But yung dalawang idea na yun. One is that these are various performances of an identity, and then it's like multiple identities that we choose from. And then one identity is maybe the professional self.
So I guess the big question is, what does authenticity mean in that context? The way you describe that, there's also another book called No Bad Parts, where we have these different experiences in our lifetime that create a certain persona, and each persona is a part of who we are. And so when we talk about whole self, what do we mean? At least from our lens, in the work we do as coaches, we talk about how people should come with their whole selves, right? That you are whole. That means there are no bad parts. All of those parts added value to where you are today, and there were insights, learnings, they kind of help to mold you, etc., etc. And so let's say I walk into a workplace, that all comes along with me. Technically, I can't check any of them at the door and say, okay, this part does not exist. I can't dismiss it. I can't discard it. But I guess what you're saying is, do I bare my soul? And do I let all of you know about all of those parts and tell you my childhood traumas and all of that in a meeting? Or do I bring it up in conversation? And maybe not, right? If I don't bring it, am I being inauthentic? So I think authenticity we can define as the values that I hold, the principles that I am adhering to. Those are the ones that keep me kind of in check and consistent. the parts of me I want to show might look, sound different, but ultimately the values and the principles remain the same. And that's how I would define authenticity. How does that make sense to you, Carl?
Well, one, I really like this idea of no bad parts. I've never come across it before. And so I really appreciate it just because I do think there's like, oh, that is not a part that I want to bring with me. Ganyan. But
Mm,
maybe it's like a part that you carry that you don't bring out, basically. That's how I'm sort of
yeah,
processing
yeah.
it. But I like this sense that there's across the identities that we hold, there are values and principles that are sustained throughout. That's what makes us who we are. My question here is, at what point can someone say, this is me, and you have to deal with it
Mm.
in that workplace setting? And I think it's funny because in our day, for older
Ooh.
people, no, right? But for older people, yung if someone showed up to work na may kulay yung buhok, maraming piercing, may mga tattoo, ganon, parang, oh, that person is like trying to express themselves as an individual, whatever. They're trying to show that they're different from other people. That's why they have the tattoo or whatever. And now it's just so normal. Like all of these things are so normal. And I celebrate that. When I come to work, you can't see my tattoo, thank God. But it's there. But I think the openness to these physical expressions of individuality have allowed us to also maybe express more of ourselves in the workplace. I don't know if that makes sense.
So what I'm hearing is that maybe it's also a matter of environment and where we are today versus where we were before, right?
Mm.
And how those transitions happened.
Yeah, I
So
think
there's
there
more
were,
acceptance, I guess,
yeah, there was a
now
lot more
for
boundaries
different things.
before, right?
Yes, yes. Oh my gosh. Side story. So in my previous company, I was told after I had joined that apparently you can't be hired if you had a tattoo. And they didn't know that I had one and it just wasn't visible at the time. So I questioned it and I asked, oh, well, does that mean you wouldn't have hired me? And so I guess, times have changed. I think there's a lot more openness to different ways of showing up as yourself. And we're much more open. But I guess the question that I'm hearing you ask is, where do you draw the line of how much you share of yourself? And the word that comes to my mind, which we've talked about in other episodes too, is this word accountability and impact. So, am I aware of what kind of impact I'm creating when I bring something of myself to the workplace? So, just because, and this is why I also am very cautious when people use assessment tools and personality tests and things like that, right? It can be used as an excuse. So I can say, well, this is how I am and this is my personality. See, the test says so. And so I have to bring that to the table because that's who I am. That's being authentic. Sorry na lang kayo kung hindi nyo siya type. Sorry na lang kayo kung medyo masama yung landing sa inyo. That to me is an inappropriate use of authenticity because you have to be accountable for the impact you create. And you have to understand the context that you're operating in. So my dad was a public servant. He worked in government, right? And he would wear Crocs everywhere. Everywhere. But he always had a pair of leather shoes in case he had to go to visit Malacanang. Very simple example, right? Sometimes he forgot it though, but he knew that in this context, there are some things that are more appropriate than others. I can be my authentic self in different ways. Doesn't mean that just because I'm in leather shoes, I'm not being my true self. I just know what the situation and the context requires, and I am adjusting.
I really appreciate that example because I think it's easier to talk about it when it's physical and externalized. That's why I was talking about the tattoos and things.
Mm.
But what we're trying to draw a line here on is being authentic while also being professional and being accountable to what it means to be a professional. And I know that each person's profession will change what that means for them, right? Kung ano yung quote-unquote official work uniform mo or what you should look like or how you should present. But what I'm thinking of is, for example, if I were going to a business meeting, and I haven't worn a suit in a very, very long time, but if it were that kind of meeting, then I would wear the suit. Hindi ako too cool to wear the suit, and I'm not gonna show up. And the thing is, I think sometimes people don't know that line of this is the kind of thing that you're showing up to. And on one level, sobrang madali yung you should be dressed this way. Because you see what the meeting invite looks like, you see where it is, you see kung sino yung mga ka-meeting mo. Diba? If I'm meeting the president or CEO of a company and then the meeting is in their boardroom, siguro
Yeah.
naman dapat nakaganyan. But if it's these people but we're meeting in a country club, then it's this thing. Like it's reading that context, but also acknowledging that that context is much easier to read for attire than it is for personal behavior. Like, okay, when I show up, dapat ba? Like, one of the terms that I really like na Filipino, I find has a difficult translation is yung presko. Yung masyado siyang presko sa meeting eh. Yung hindi siya, yung feeling niya, yung, right, yung presko is like, masyadong komportable, too laid back, or felt too friendly when this is a, and again, those are things that need to be navigated, but understanding how to position in a meeting while still
Yep.
being yourself. I just want to acknowledge at this point, that's a really hard thing to do,
It is.
especially if you don't have that much experience doing it.
Yeah. No, and I like that you're using that Filipino reference, right, of presko. The other one that I think might be appropriate here is the concept of pakikiramdam and pakiramdam, right? We say that, right? Pakiramdam ka, tinan mo kung ano yung dapat, ano yung tama dun sa konteksto na pinapasukan mo. And if you have that ability to feel through what is needed in the moment, then you can still, I think, create that balance of being authentic and showing up in a way that is appropriate.
Going on this whole language bent here, but yung pakiramdam, I really like it because yun nga, I feel it out eh. Parang
Yes.
you have to feel the situation eh. The other one I like na medyo mas burara is lumugar ka, which is contextual and geographical. Yung lugar, di ba? Nasaan
Yes.
yung lugar na yan? At ikaw, saan dapat yung lugar mo dyan? Like, what, di ba? Where are you? Right? Lugar. But also, lumugar ka is find your position here, which also connotes
Yeah.
hierarchy. It connotes position. And I know we don't want to be super obsessed about rank and all that stuff. But also, sometimes, like, if you're in a meeting, you need to figure out what points you are open to speak and what points you should be sitting there letting the other people talk.
Yes, I agree. And I know it's so hard to do. And I acknowledge that. There's value in creating a higher level of cognizance of yourself and of others. If I don't get feedback, for example, that ay medyo presko pala yung dating ko dun sa meeting na yon. Kung wala naman nagsasabi sa akin, hindi ko matututunan yon. 'Di ba? I won't learn the lesson. I won't feel a need to change because I'm not getting the feedback that I need. So there is something about cognizance and working on it too that allows you to kind of dance with these situations a little better.
Yeah, so this is stuff that we're talking about, finding yourself in a meeting and trying to understand what your position is, or finding yourself in different settings. But the other thing here with the bringing your whole self to work, I guess my curiosity with that is on the emotional level. I suppose because I don't think that I should be bringing that whole thing. Like, I'll absorb everything from work, but it's not something that needs to be processed and brought back in. I'm sure you're familiar with this, and I'm sure a lot of leaders are familiar with this sense. Like, we absorb a lot of things, we have a lot of feelings, but those feelings cannot be released within our workplace context. So we have to find an external release for it. But by the same token, wouldn't it be fair for us to expect that employees don't necessarily have to bring all their emotions to work?
Yeah, so I think this is one of those things that has evolved over time. I also grew up in the corporate world at a time when bawal ang emotions sa workplace. You check those at the door, you put on a game face, and you grin and bear it. Especially when I got to leadership management roles, we were literally told that you can't be transparent when it comes to your feelings because that's not what a leader does. And we're finding in our work, in our practice now, that is changing. That is changing. There is a recognition, and this is one of the things we believe as coaches too, right? Your whole self includes all of these different aspects of emotionality, psychological, physical, all of that comes with you. And emotions, they're very difficult to manage, right? Because they can get the better of you. It's the reactivity to emotion, I think, that we're afraid of more. It's how am I managing and expressing these emotions? I think that's why we said, we don't want that here, right? But if we view emotions differently, here we like to reference the work of Susan David in Emotional Agility. She talks about emotions as data points and data that tell us that something is important to us in that particular moment. And so, if we're able to look at emotions as, okay, this is telling me that something's important to me, I can express it in a way that is less reactive. I think that's where you can still express and acknowledge, but not necessarily use it as a way to, to railroad a meeting. So we talked about that and emotional dashboard in previous episodes too. So I think that's when it's okay. Does that make sense to you, Carl?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about our earlier episode about layoffs when
Yes, exactly.
being open and accepting that this is part of the emotion that needs to go through because you're coming at it as a human being and you're embracing
Yeah.
all of that. But I guess it makes sense to me because I come from a context of many boundaries. And so therefore,
Hmm.
I choose what to share. But what happens when I'm dealing with someone who's the opposite na zero boundaries and just shares everything?
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm just giving the thought experiment of it's just someone who will just keep sharing everything that they're thinking and feeling, and you're just like, I know that's you, but I don't want all of you. Like, is that awful of me?
No, I mean, it's hard. It's hard to take all of that in. We could go down a really, really deep rabbit hole here. But what about it makes you uncomfortable, I guess, is the question I have.
Like I was saying with the boundaries, I think there are certain things that you talk to your boss with, and then there's certain things that you can talk to your colleagues about, and then certain things that you go, have a beer over, and
Mm-hmm.
certain things that you don't talk about in the office and you just bring to your friends.
Mm.
And that's sort of where I am with that is the context
Yeah.
and the relationship which you have with people.
Yes.
And as an example, I am kind of an older dude with an edgy sense of humor. I'm a middle-aged
Okay.
man with an edgy sense of humor, and take with that what you will. And so sometimes I have jokes, and they're very,
Mm-hmm.
very good jokes
Mm.
during a meeting. But there are one or two people on my team that I trust, and I will send them the joke. And they're like, this is very funny, but never say this to anyone else. Ganyan.
Mm.
And then sometimes it's, hey, this is really funny. You should share this with the team. So, yung knowing who I can share that with, knowing which barriers exist, uh, navigating that, and also knowing, like, for example, I am in a leadership position. Parang hindi yata tama na nag-share ako ng silly jokes at the most inopportune times. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's it's me positioning, and I don't feel like I'm not bringing my whole self to work just because I
Yeah.
can't make that joke. It's that I also understand what is the proper behavior for my position. And I think
Mm.
maybe that becomes the sticking point for some people is
Mm.
what is what happens when quote unquote proper behavior bangs up against personal expression. Yung this is
Mm.
me. This is how I operate. This is a feeling that I have, and I need to be allowed to express this feeling at work. Or I need to be allowed to talk to my boss about this thing, but maybe it isn't
Yeah.
yeah.
So here's what's coming up for me as you're sharing that. I'm thinking, okay, this whole idea of understanding context and what's appropriate is such a big thing, I think, in this topic, right? And what have I seen that's helpful? And maybe an offer here is thinking of others. So we have what we call listening lenses that we teach in coaching. And there's two lenses that you could have. One is a me lens, a self lens, where I'm thinking of myself. What do I need to share? How do I be authentic? How do I express myself? What's going on in my mind and my heart? And I'm just telling other people, right? And then there's also an other lens where I'm thinking about what does this person need to hear or learn about me so that we can work better together, so that we can resolve a problem? What is it that they need to hear so that they can help me if that's my intention? I hope that helps because maybe it's in the self lens that it goes a little too far, right? I'm not thinking about the other and how will this land on them? Do they really need to know about it? What value will it bring if they hear all of these stories about me and my sob stories, right? Uh, yeah. What do you think? Does that help?
No, that's really helpful kasi that just means you have to temper yung self. Like this is a new framework for me, which I really like. Yung
Mm,
self lens versus the other lens. It just means that
mm,
there are some people who are skewed so much to self lens that they don't factor in enough yung other lens, and that's why
mm.
you sort of get all of that expression without the consideration of what the endpoint or function of that expression is. I know I'm being really like Western and technical about like what is the function of this thing so that I can parang I at risk of sounding manipulative or ano, diba, like the reason why I'm sharing this is because I want this person to do this, but diba, I mean that is what we navigate at work, right? We're all trying to get somewhere, and we're all trying to get other people to get us there. Like
Yeah.
let's go there together. And sometimes there are these things that get in the way, but being able to cultivate that other lens seems like an important thing, especially if you're young. I mean, I think once you're a little older, if you're older and you have some measure of success, it means that you found some way to navigate this professionalism versus personal expression. But if you're still figuring it out, that's really helpful.
I do want to go back to what you said about the other lens and
Yeah.
being able to see what that other person is thinking. I'm glad that you appreciate that. I think as a culture, we have something that's already ingrained in us, right? This concept of kapwa, pakikipagkapwa. It's really being mindful of the collective versus just the self. And sometimes to a point of sacrifice, maybe, and maybe some people take that a little too far, but it is knowing that okay, for the sake of the collective, here's what I need to do and bring and not do and bring as well, right? There is a shared inner humanity that has.
I remember one of the nicest compliments that people can give is marunong siya makisama. Like as a way to
Mm.
recommend someone. Marunong siya makisama. Or madaling pakisamahan.
Yeah, I guess maybe there are levels. Maybe there are levels. So pakikisama might entail going with the flow. Maybe
Mm.
there's even a little bit of peer pressure
Oh, I
there.
see.
Group think even. But if it's pakikipagkapwa, it is about what is the greater good.
I see.
Does that make
No,
sense?
that's really helpful. Yeah, because it differentiates that there's one layer and then there's an additional, more
Yeah.
meaningful layer that could be reached.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, one of the worst things that is not a compliment is, hindi naman niya marunong makisama. Like, it's, that guy does not know how to hang.
Yeah.
So, I like this sense that kapwa, like, it's such a meaningful word to it. But as we round out, I guess, is there any big thoughts? I feel like we didn't really have any answers, and that's okay, because everyone needs to navigate their own thing. Obviously, being super quiet and only speaking, that was actually never me. I got in a lot of trouble because I kept talking when I shouldn't have. Hindi ako marunong lumugaro dati. Uh, but I've learned. I've learned that you have to know when to speak. You have to know what tone you need to take, and it's a journey to figure that out and to become a better teammate, to become a better workmate. If you want those things, you really have to navigate. And there's only general principles that we can put forward as opposed to specific directions.
Yeah. And I guess those principles, in summary, are what we've talked about here: authenticity, accountability, and context. And that might be a different thing for each of us. We have to figure out what that means for us.
I'd throw in here that we also continue to change, and we continue
Absolutely.
to change within the different workplaces that we inhabit. So every time it's a new opportunity for us to build out a better identity. I'm Carl Javier.
And I'm Jackie Cañiza. Thank you for listening to The Imaginable Workplace. This podcast is brought to you by Haraya Coaching, a company rooted in wholeness that supports individuals and teams by creating brave and safe spaces for transformation.
In partnership with Puma Podcast, an award-winning podcast production company that aims to spread the joy, power, and value there is in listening. This episode was produced and written by Macy Hoven and Jen Horn, and edited by Joe Salcedo.
If you appreciated this podcast, then we're sure you know someone else who'd also want to improve their workplace. So please share this with a colleague or friend, and follow the show on your podcast app for more stories, data, and insights on creating your imaginable workplace. Would you like us to show up at your workplace? We want to hang out with our listeners and have these conversations with you in person. Just drop us a note at Haraya Coaching on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook to see us soon.